Welcome to Kayhan Life podcasts. As Iran's presidential elections get underway, with candidates this week sparring for votes and televised debates before Election Day on June 18th, the controversial lineup of mostly hardline runners has caused concern both inside and outside Iran. But what does this election mean for Iran's future, and is it any different to past elections held by the Islamic Republic? Behnam Ben Taleblu, an analyst focusing on Iranian security and politics at Washington-based think tank the Foundation for Defence of Democracies, where he is a senior fellow, offers answers to these questions and explains the mechanics behind the controversial election and what he thinks this election means for Iran, its people, and the country's current regime. Behnam, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you. The election process in Iran has left Iranians, state leaders around the world, and international human rights organizations very worried about the fairness of these upcoming elections and also concerned about the presidential hopefuls' pasts. So can you give us some background to these elections, who's running, and why that matters in the current and rather tense political climate in the region?
Sure. So it's no surprise that the Islamic Republic, despite being an Islamist authoritarian regime, and despite in practice really shunning both of those words, as a former candidate for supreme leader who is now deceased, Ayatollah Montazeri once said, the Islamic Republic is neither Islamic nor a republic. It still covets the pretense of a republic. It still covets the legitimacy that comes with elections. And so every 4 years, you do tend to have, in the 41-year history of the Islamic Republic, these presidential election cycles where there is this body called the Guardian Council that approves candidates, quote-unquote, running for public office on a whole slate of somewhat discriminatory, you could say, vectors. In this election cycle, there are about 592 registered candidates, including many regime insiders from the increasingly narrow political spectrum of the Islamic Republic. But even within this increasingly narrow spectrum, the regime, and particularly Iran's Supreme Leader Khamenei, who uses the Guardian Council to kind of cement certain candidates' legitimacy and to sort of drag the political system further to the right and also contract the acceptable boundaries for political space in the Islamic Republic. The Guardian Council did basically weeded out even principalist or what you could say is the traditional right flank in Iran to help make the far right flank or the ultra hardline flank more mainstream. Of those 592 candidates, the Guardian Council said they only took about 40 of those candidates seriously. And now we have 7 fully registered candidates who are participating in 3 different sets of debates in advance of the election, or shall we say selection, on June 18th. The perceived frontrunner and person that both Iranians and many outside the world believe to be the Supreme Leader's favorite or preferred candidate is Ebrahim Raisi, the head of the judiciary, a former head of a major financial conglomerate / religious charity with that's basically functioning as a multi-billion-dollar slush fund tied to Iran's Supreme Leader. Unfortunately, he's well known on crimes he committed even well under the age of 30 in the service of the Islamic Republic. He was basically part of a death commission in the late 1980s that oversaw the mass execution of upwards of 5,000 political prisoners in Iran. So he's someone who has not shied away from shedding blood to keep the regime on a revolutionary trajectory. There are several other hardline candidates that really form the majority of this ballot. So there's a former nuclear negotiator who served under the Ahmadinejad administration, and he's got ties to the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. His name is Saeed Jalili. You could basically say that despite Ebrahim Raisi having all this blood on his hands and having kind of been anointed by the Supreme Leader as the preferred candidate, there are people even to his right flank, and Saeed Jalili is one of those folks. There are others, of course, also to his right, Zaghani, who used to run a major media conglomerate. But there's also kind of the token technocrat, if you will, which is looking to receive the protest vote in the Islamic Republic. Abdul Nasser Hemmati, tied to Iran's central bank, where previously he led other financial institutions, but ultimately he kind of became Iran's chief illicit financier with his seat at the helm of the central bank. So in totality, you have basically a hardline-dominated ballot, and it comes at a very interesting time in the Islamic Republic where really in the past could say, electoral cycles, the Iranian people have turned out to vote for what they perceive to be the candidate farthest away from the supreme leader's preference, as well as what they would say the least bad candidate. But unfortunately, in every electoral cycle, it seems like that slate continues to contract, continues to narrow, and continues to move to what is in the Islamic Republic's political spectrum, their version of the far right.
You've touched on Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's involvement in these elections. To what extent has he influenced this process?
Khamenei likes to appoint agents and affiliates throughout Iran's entire Byzantine bureaucracy to carry out his will. There's different assessments about how he operates. Some say he micromanages. Others say by appointing these, constellation of figures in Iran's political bureaucracy, he's able to exert his will without having to check in at every single moment. But you could say that the stamp that the Guardian Council did give actually is his version of a stamp as well. It's his affirmation of where the Iranian political spectrum should go. And while many are looking at this quote-unquote election through the prism of what does it mean for the Iranian people, of course, many of whom are looking to boycott the election this go-around, or what might it mean for the nuclear issue or for U.S. policy, let's not forget Ali Khamenei is Iran's most important voter. He may be the country's only voter of consequence, and his title is Supreme Leader, and that's a title meant to be taken rather literally. So I think the candidates that are present, as well as the person who eventually wins and is declared victor, as well as Iran's response in the aftermath of that victory, will tell us so much more about the direction that he wants the country to go in. And lest we forget, he is a man who is in the 8th decade of his life, 3rd decade of his career, and has really been in a constellation of different positions in the 4-decade history of the Islamic Republic. So what you could say he's looking for in this electoral round, and the candidates certainly reflect it, is to cement his legacy and his predecessor's legacy.
As you've mentioned, Ibrahim Raisi is Khamenei's favoured candidate. Does that make him a shoo-in to win? And if so, what would things like the nuclear deal, Iran's trade with the outside world, and human rights look like under his leadership?
It's an excellent question because Ibrahim Raisi, as well as certain other candidates, for instance, there's a candidate who seems to run several times. He's the former commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps from, I think, about 1981 to 1997. Mohsen Rezai is his name. He's run, I think, about 3 times now, or 4 times, if I'm not mistaken. And each time he gets a very, very, very marginal percent of the vote, but he continues to find his way onto the ballot. He's the head of Iran's Expediency Council, which allegedly adjudicates quarrels between Iran's parliament and Iran's Guardian Council. But there are several folks that do have views that are greatly akin to Khamenei, but lest we forget, the entire ballot is consisting of people, whether you want to label them as technocrat or ultra-hardliner, all of them are loyal to the Islamic Republic, and all of them espouse the founding principle of the Islamic Republic, which is the guardianship of the jurist, which is basically the intellectual, religious, and political foundation for the position of supreme leader. And in the 4-decade history of the Islamic Republic, there have only been 2 supreme leaders. So to transpose that back onto Raisi ran in 2017 and certainly did not win. In fact, Iran has a history in its short electoral cycles to have a trend of second-term incumbency. So even though Raisi in 2017 was talked about publicly in the press, got a bump up in his title, people started calling him Ayatollah Raisi, people started talking about his background more, he did not win in that election. And many saw his failure in 2017 as Khamenei potentially burning a bridge for Raisi, perhaps elevating him, seeing how well he could do, and then burning a bridge when he saw that he was unable to mobilize a sufficient political support base. Ultimately, I think with the perspective of 4 years and seeing Raisi run again, that may be an incorrect assessment, because as we know, Khamenei cares little about what the wishes or votes of the Iranian people are, but at the same time is content shuffling a whole series of folks around. And if Khamenei does ultimately push Raisi through with rather low electoral turnout as is expected, and I'm sure we can get into later, then it means that Khamenei knows that he can dispense with the fig leaf of moderation, where you can have a different sort of looking, a different sort of sounding president, You can dispense with the fact that Iran's political system is open to debate. In fact, it's not. There's certain things that a Raisi presidency would accomplish for Khamenei. But if Raisi wins, it's a harbinger of things to come. But lest we forget, it's not the president who will be driving the train on this issue. They'll simply be one of the most important passengers on this revolutionary train.
Are we likely to see the same narrative over things like the nuclear deal?
It's an interesting question because even though Iran's foreign and security policy is set well above the president remains Iran, at least on paper, Iran's second most important person. And you've seen very different approaches to the nuclear issue domestically, politically, and economically inside the Islamic Republic under different presidencies. Now, that doesn't mean that they were doing something against the wishes of Iran's supreme leader. It's that Iran's supreme leader has put different red lines and boundaries around every president's freedom of maneuver. For instance, under the Ahmadinejad administration, 2005 to 2013, with that second term being, as you know, highly contested due to the fraudulent 2009 presidential elections, Iran was comfortable using its nuclear program. The supreme leader was comfortable using its nuclear program to take on the West. So in this instance, I would say that the most important engine of Iran's nuclear program is still going to be the supreme leader. And in fact, we saw a recent press report, I think, in Bloomberg and Reuters, quoting Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson, if I'm not mistaken, saying that Iran's nuclear policy is essentially going to be the same. And when we look at what's happening now, it's essentially nuclear extortion, where Iran is incrementally violating not just the 2015 nuclear deal, known as the JCPOA, but it's also violating its safeguards obligations and other obligations under the non-proliferation regime when it comes to undeclared sites, activities, and material. And all this is really political leverage to get Washington to give it sanctions relief. But if you have an ultra-hardliner at the helm, they may not need to feign the moderation to get the relief quicker. You've seen the U.S. committed to 5-6 rounds of indirect nuclear diplomacy at Vienna just to resurrect what is a fast expiring and, as we know, fatally flawed deal. So I think you're going to see the core of the nuclear program remain the same, the philosophy remain the same, that you can use the program to extort the West, but perhaps some different methods or trends. But ultimately, the president is going to be carrying out someone else's nuclear policy while trying to impact at the margins through rhetoric and different coalitions inside the country.
The United Nations has repeatedly expressed concern about what appear to be escalating breaches and violations of human rights in the country against Iranians. Do you think that under Raisi, that escalation will continue and get worse?
I certainly think it's going to be a situation of getting from bad to worse. And it's one of my many quarrels with the current U.S. approach to Iran is that the intellectual framing of the Iran threat, even though you hear various folks in the administration of President Biden talking about wanting to get a longer and stronger deal and talking about the human rights issue and talking about missiles and terrorism and Iran's regional malign activities, the bulk of their political attention is devoted to the nuclear issue. You could say it's nuclear uber alles. And unfortunately, things like these human rights reports, the brave struggle of the Iranian people are falling by the wayside. So, my advice for the existing U.S. administration is be cognizant of Iran's electoral dynamics, of its political contests, but don't be consumed by them. There seems to have really been a rush to try to deliver sanctions relief to the Islamic Republic before the presidential election cycle. And now that we are living through that cycle, there seems to be a rush to try to get it before there's a transition in early August, which is when June to August is the quote-unquote lame duck period for this Iranian president, for Hassan Rouhani. So, my advice would be to slow things down and to focus not on the nuclear issue, but on those broader issues that you mentioned, in particular human rights, because that does tie in to what has been going on in the street for the past 3-4 years, but in many ways for the past 4 decades. There's always been protests against the Islamic Republic. That's something that the Islamic Republic tries to hide because it always likes to say that it came to power through a social revolution, that it actually, its political base is on the streets. But when you look at the different iterations of labor strikes and protest movements in the past 4 decades, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, you've seen under actually peak periods of foreign pressure, domestic protests in Iran move from, and me and several former colleagues have written about this, move from touting reform to coveting revolution. And this is something I think the Biden administration should not take its eyes off of. And it's precisely because of things like the deteriorating human rights situation in Iran, the fact that selections in Iran are called elections, the fact that the economy is in free fall, and the fact that the government is increasingly composed of folks who don't want to put, to borrow a phrase, Iran first. They have an ideology, and they're working to further the regime and and those who would support the regime and that ideology, oftentimes at the expense of the nation, and definitely, as you see through the different iterations of protest, at the expense of the people. So the human rights situation is something that I would expect to get worse anyway. Perhaps with someone at Raisi at the helm, it'll be an accelerant given his bloody past.
Coming back for a moment to the current elections, there's been intense speculation over voter turnout in general. Several polls have been carried out over the last few days suggesting voter turnout as low as 15%. That was in a poll run by Gammon, to 38% from a survey conducted by Iran Students Polling Agency, and a more optimistic 47% by a Press TV study, which, as we know, is a state-affiliated news outlet, and which also suggests that the 47% will increase as voting goes on. Where do you think voter turnout truly sits for these elections?
Polling has always been a problem, even in Western democracies, let alone the polling challenges in an authoritarian regime, as well as the polling challenges in a place like the Islamic Republic. I find all the numbers interesting, but my back-of-the-envelope calculation from this far away, as well as my analysis of these trends in the past protest history of the Islamic Republic, particularly in the past 3 to 4 years, is that you're likely to have a much lower turnout. You've had one debate, we're about to have another. Usually this is the intensification period where there's more campaigning and then there is a surge in public interest. But those things can't happen in a vacuum. And in fact, when you add in what happened the past 3-4 years on the political scene, on the economic scene, as it relates to Iranian foreign and security policy, as it relates to U.S.-Iran strategic competition, and perhaps most importantly, bread and butter issues for the Iranian people, you're likely going to see this much lower turnout. And that shift in the Iranian protest mentality from reform, 99, 2009, to revolution, 2017, 18, 19, 20, and those different iterations of protests, really tells you that the Islamic Republic was until very recently in a defeat loop where it had a continually smaller and smaller social base that was willing to show up for it, to accomplish things for it, that could feign legitimacy for it. So that contracting social base, that contracting economic situation, that continued preferencing of regime interest over national interest is likely going to be one of the things that move the polling and that move the turnout, in my view, towards the lower end of the polls that you mentioned. My back of the envelope calculation, again, just from this far away, probably 20 to 30% at max. I think, obviously, there's going to be no real way to verify this because the regime is intent on signaling a high turnout and probably will use certain voter polling lines and pictures on repeat, will inflate the numbers, will make the contest look what it exactly is not, which is a contest. In the aggregate, try to say that there was robust turnout because the regime has used high turnout as a shield against foreign pressure to say, look, we're competitive, we have these elections. But in reality, when you look at what's been happening, particularly since 2009, and given Khamenei's willingness to continue to contract the political system and move it further and further to the hard right, so as to get us a loyal second generation of revolutionaries to enshrine his legacy, is that they've lost people, and they've lost a lot of people. And so ultimately, I think you were going to have a low turnout. If past is prologue, we're certainly going to have a low turnout given the February 2020 parliamentary elections, which came not just after the killing of Soleimani, but the protest that followed the downing of the Ukrainian airliner. Something now that I believe the Canadian judicial system has said was not an accident. So I think the Iranian people know much more so than ever before the fact that these are not elections, the fact that voting would accomplish exactly what Khamenei says it would accomplish, which is that it's not a vote for a certain candidate, and here I'm paraphrasing Khamenei, it's a vote for the Islamic Republic. And when you look at Iranian political behavior, the domestic political attitudes and behavior of the Iranian population, everything they're saying is that they want to be rid of this Islamic Republic, not to continue to affirm its existence.
So are the current elections a stepping stone for a broader agenda being run by Khamenei, which could potentially include Raisi taking over as supreme leader when the time is right?
I certainly think there are several drivers that make this election or selection, shall we say, for Khamenei very timely and very important. And while, again, in the West, we might say, well, of course, it's important for Khamenei because the US and Iran are currently engaged in indirect nuclear diplomacy through the other members of the P5+1. It's much more than that for Khamenei. It's an opportunity for him, should an ultra-hardliner like Raisi win, to continue to drag the system further to the right. When we look at this factional composition inside the Islamic Republic, the people that the Guardian Council on behalf of Khamenei have disqualified in the past, and when you've seen this massive political contraction since 2009, and a colleague and I are actually writing an op-ed about this right now, you see basically Khamenei, through the Guardian Council, forcing the population to continue to have to settle for less, forcing the reformist faction to continue to have to contract, to continue to have to vote for candidates that are less and less reformist, till they get to the position where they were in 2013, where Hassan Rouhani was endorsed by the reformist faction, even though he himself is not a reformist, to continue to have to bring in state bureaucrats, people with deep ties to Iran's security services, to be running in these sorts of elections. When you have someone like the former parliament speaker, who is a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War and a veteran of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Ali Larijani, be disqualified, when you have two former heads of Iran's Atomic Energy Agency, I believe Faridun Abbasi and Ali Akbar Salehi, be disqualified, when you have the IRGC nodding to a potential Raisi presidency, it tells you everything you need to know about what Khamenei's intentions are, that this presents him yet another opportunity to get rid of the fig leaf of moderation, given the fact that you're going to have sanctions relief impending from the U.S. anyway, given the U.S. interest to stem Iranian nuclear escalation and just return to a new normal. And, of course, Khamenei moving the system further to the right and contracting it, as well as thinking about cementing his legacy. And even if Raisi doesn't become the next supreme leader, it would be a very astute thing for Khamenei to do if he's looking to cement his legacy, to have someone like Raisi, who has no domestic political standing of his own, who owes much to Khamenei, and who is loyal to the revolution and has spilled blood very early on in his career for the revolution, to have him at the helm. Because if Raisi, or whoever is the next president, serves 2 terms, that would mean Khamenei would be in the 9th decade of his life. And if he passes at that point in time, or earlier than that, then someone who is a hardline president can do more from the bully pulpit to keep Iran on a revolutionary trajectory when there are more and more and more domestic forces of change against the state.
If the trajectory for Iran is ever right-leaning, what does that mean for the future of Iran, Iranians, and the world at large?
It's a very precarious situation if you're an Iranian, because when you look at the things that the revolution was made in the name of, the Islamic Republic has strayed, shall we say, rather far away from them. In essence, it's been more than a century since Iranians have been looking for representative government. They still haven't achieved that. When you look at the way the Islamic Republic has narrowed its own political elite, has continued to remain on this trajectory where the boundary of acceptable political space has been contracting, you see exactly what is going on in the country now, which is that everything is a political crisis, whether it's got economic roots, environmental roots, social roots, religious roots, and public health roots, as exposed through the way the regime botched the handling of the COVID-19 crisis inside the country. Everything becomes a political crisis. And ultimately, the chasm that we see between state and society in the Islamic Republic is going to grow and grow and grow. And if you're looking at this from a policy perspective, it means that the regime, which is repressive at home, is going to continue to be repressive at home at the same time as it's going to be aggressive abroad. And so if there is going to be a revolution at some point in time, it looks like at first there is going to be a devolution first, that there is going to be a hardening or a coarsening of the way the Islamic Republic conducts business at home and abroad. And the Raisi presidency wouldn't necessarily be indicative of that, but it would help to explain that.
Very concerning. Thank you, Behnam. Thank you so much.
Pleasure. Thank you so much.